Welcome to Oracle Prime. In 1942, the United States government did something that sounds almost unbelievable today. It told every American citizen, if you own more than 5 tires, you must surrender the extras to the federal authorities. The national speed limit was slashed to 35 miles per hour, not to save gasoline, but to save rubber. Factory guards patrolled parking lots with tire pressure gauges, writing up workers whose tires were even slightly underinflated, because soft tires wore out faster. A rubber tire, one of the most forgettable objects in modern life. And yet, in the winter of 1942, it became a matter of national survival. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, capturing Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. In a matter of weeks, the United States lost access to roughly 90% of the world's natural rubber supply. And in 1942, rubber was the absolute lifeblood of mechanized civilization. Equipping a single soldier required 32 pounds of rubber for boots, packs, and gear. Building a military airplane consumed half a ton of it. A single tank required a full ton. Without rubber, the Allied war machine would have ground to a halt. The government launched what it called the Salvage for Victory campaign, urging citizens to donate anything made of rubber: old tires, garden hoses, rubber boots, even children's toys. Driving became a strictly regulated privilege, and out of that terrifying scarcity, a quiet but remarkable innovation was born: liquid tire sealants. Formulas that could be injected inside a tire to seal punctures automatically, extending the life of irreplaceable rubber by months or even years. Today, on Oracle Prime, we are pulling that innovation out of the history books. We love exploring the forgotten ingenuity of the past on this channel. Not just the grand battles, but the practical survival skills that kept ordinary people alive and moving during extraordinary times. This is the story of a $2 liquid that can seal most tire punctures before you even notice them, why it was developed, how it works, and why it quietly disappeared from mainstream knowledge, not because of a conspiracy, but because of something far more interesting: the economics of products nobody can patent. Let us open the vault. Part 1. The Birth of a Desperate Science. With natural rubber gone, the United States government and the chemical industry launched one of the largest emergency industrial programs in American history: the creation of synthetic rubber from scratch. The scale was staggering. Production of synthetic rubber in America went from fewer than 4,000 tons in 1942 to over 750,000 tons by 1945. But while the chemists were racing to invent new polymers, millions of people on the ground still had to keep their existing, aging, irreplaceable tires from going flat. And this is where ingenuity stepped in. In 1944, an inventor named Clint Young, working out of East St. Louis, Illinois, filed a patent for what he called a puncture-proof, self-sealing pneumatic tire. His patent, number 2,489,995, described a layered system applied to the inside of a tire, a self-healing rubber compound with loose woven fabric embedded in it, designed so that when a nail or sharp object pierced the tread, the compound would flow into the wound and seal it shut before significant air could escape. Young was not alone. Throughout the mid-1940s, several inventors filed similar patents. The core chemistry was elegantly simple. Combine a carrier fluid that resists freezing and evaporation, a fibrous material that tangles into puncture holes, and a binding agent that solidifies the plug under pressure. These formulas did not just sit passively inside a tire. They actively protected it from the inside out, remaining fluid across a wide temperature range. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the concept had moved beyond individual patents into practical fleet use. Heavy-duty trucking operators and military logistics units, entities that could not afford the downtime of a flat tire, began experimenting with liquid sealant compounds injected directly into tire cavities. For a long-haul trucker in the 1950s, a flat tire on a remote highway didn't just cost money, it cost an entire day. For a military convoy, it could cost lives. The principle was proven. The chemistry worked. So what happened? Part 2. The Science of the Seal. Before we answer that question, let us understand exactly how this liquid performs its small miracle, because the science is genuinely fascinating. A tire sealant formula, whether the industrial versions from the 1940s or a homemade version you could mix today, has three essential components: a carrier fluid, structural fibers, and a binding agent. The carrier fluid is typically glycerin-based. Glycerin is a thick, non-toxic liquid that you can buy at any pharmacy. In this application, it serves a critical dual purpose. First, it refuses to evaporate inside the sealed environment of a tire, unlike plain water, which would dry out within weeks. Second, it acts as a powerful antifreeze. A proper glycerin-water mixture can withstand temperatures plunging to -30 degrees Fahrenheit without solidifying. Its heavy, viscous nature also keeps the solid particles suspended evenly, rather than settling to the bottom of the tire when the car is parked. The structural fibers are the physical plugging material. In the original industrial formulations, these included ground rubber particles and various textile fibers. In a modern DIY version, finely shredded natural latex rubber serves the same function. The binding agent, historically a rubber cement compound, provides the adhesive that solidifies the plug permanently once it forms. Now here is where it gets beautiful. When you drive, the centrifugal force of the spinning wheel distributes the liquid in a thin, even coating along the entire inner surface of the tire tread. Picture it: a microscopic army, standing at attention along every square inch of the inner wall, waiting. The moment a nail or screw pierces the tire, the high-pressure air inside tries to escape through that tiny new hole. But as the air rushes toward the breach, it drags the heavy glycerin, the latex fibers, and the binding agent directly into the puncture. Within 2 to 3 seconds, just a few rotations of the wheel, the fibers snag on the jagged edges of the torn rubber. They tangle together, forming what I like to call a microscopic beaver dam. The air pressure itself rams the particles tighter and tighter into the gap, while the binding agent begins to cure and harden. The puncture is sealed. In many cases, before your tire pressure monitoring system even registers a meaningful drop. Think about that for a moment. A nail hits your tire at 65 miles per hour, and by the time your wheel has turned 3 more times, the hole is already plugged. No blowout, no pulling over, no waiting in the rain for a tow truck. Part 3. Why this disappeared from the mainstream. Now comes the question everyone is waiting for. If this technology works, why is it not standard on every car sold today? Here is where the real story gets more interesting than any conspiracy theory. The answer is not that some shadowy corporate boardroom decided to suppress this technology. The answer lies in how markets actually work, and specifically in one simple economic principle. You cannot build a profitable business around a product that anyone can make in their kitchen. Think about it from a business perspective. Glycerin, rubber fibers, and rubber cement are all commodity materials. No company can patent the basic combination. That means no exclusive manufacturing rights, no protected profit margins, and most importantly, no marketing budget. The products that dominate store shelves are the ones backed by companies with billions of dollars in advertising. A $2 homemade sealant has no corporate champion. Compare this to what the tire industry did develop. Run-flat tires that cost 2 to 3 times more than standard tires and usually cannot be repaired once punctured, requiring full replacement. Road hazard protection plans that dealerships sell for up to $80 per tire. An entire roadside assistance ecosystem that generates billions in annual revenue. These are all products that create recurring revenue, repeat customers, subscription models. A one-time $2 preventive treatment that might keep a tire running for its entire natural lifespan? That is the opposite of a recurring revenue product. No venture capitalist funds that. No tire chain stocks it prominently because the profit margin is negligible. Now, to be fair, commercial tire sealants do exist. Products like Slime, TireJect, and Flatout are available at any auto parts store. So the technology itself is not hidden. What faded from common knowledge was the DIY tradition, the understanding that you can create an effective version yourself for a fraction of the commercial price, using the same chemical principles that were developed during wartime. There is also a legitimate technical reason that modern car manufacturers do not endorse preventive sealants. Today's vehicles are far more complex than the heavy-duty trucks of the 1950s. Tire pressure monitoring systems, computerized wheel balancing, warranty structures. These all create friction. But the core chemistry has not changed. The physics still work. The question is whether the application makes sense for your specific situation. Part 4. The DIY Formula from History. So here is the formula, adapted from the historical principles for modern use. The total cost is under $2 per tire. You will need food-grade glycerin, available at any pharmacy, a tube of standard rubber cement from a hardware store, distilled water, and a pair of natural latex rubber gloves, which will serve as your fibrous media. You will also need a valve core removal tool, which costs about $3 at any auto parts store, and a large syringe or a turkey baster for injection. Here is the process. In a clean jar, combine 4 ounces of food-grade glycerin with 2 ounces of distilled water and approximately 1 tablespoon of rubber cement. Take your latex glove and use scissors to cut it into the finest strips you can manage. Then snip those strips into tiny squares, no larger than a grain of rice. Add these into your liquid and stir vigorously for about 60 seconds. The mixture should appear slightly cloudy and thick, with the latex particles suspended throughout. Remove the wheel from the vehicle. Use your valve core tool to remove the valve core from the stem. Draw the mixture into your syringe and inject the full batch into the open valve stem. If it is too thick to flow, stir in 1 additional tablespoon of distilled water. Reinstall the valve core tightly and reinflate the tire to the recommended PSI, which you will find on the sticker inside your driver's side door jamb. Finally, spin the wheel by hand about 30 times to begin distributing the fluid. Then bolt it back on and drive slowly around the block for 5 minutes. The centrifugal force will coat the entire inner liner, positioning your sealant to deploy instantly the next time road debris strikes. For under $8, you have treated all 4 tires on your vehicle. Part 5. The honest limitations you need to know now. I would be doing you a disservice if I presented this as a miracle solution with no downsides. Oracle Prime is built on giving you the full picture, not just the exciting parts. So here are the real limitations. TPMS sensors. Almost all modern cars built after 2007 have electronic tire pressure monitoring sensors mounted inside the wheel. Liquid sealants can potentially clog the tiny pressure port on these sensors, or corrode the electronics. Replacing a damaged TPMS sensor can cost between $50 and $150 per wheel. If your vehicle has external TPMS sensors mounted on the valve stem rather than inside the wheel, this concern is significantly reduced. Mechanic compatibility. If you get a puncture that is too large for the sealant to handle, the tire technician will have to dismount a tire filled with messy liquid. Many shops will charge extra for this, and some will refuse to apply a permanent vulcanizing patch because the sealant residue interferes with their adhesive bonding. Wheel balance. If you inject too much liquid, or if the particles clump together rather than distributing evenly, you can throw your wheel out of balance. At highway speeds, this creates vibration that is not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. Follow the quantities precisely. Solvent concerns. Rubber cement contains volatile solvents. In the enclosed, heated environment of a tire during driving, these solvents will vaporize. While the quantities in this formula are small, it is worth being aware of. Puncture size limits. This formula effectively seals tread punctures up to approximately 1/4 inch in diameter. It will not save you from a catastrophic sidewall blowout, structural failure from dry rot, or a damaged rim. Those are situations that require professional tire replacement, period. And critically, this approach is best suited for vehicles with simpler wheel setups, older trucks, trailers, farm equipment, ATVs, lawnmowers, and wheelbarrows. For your daily driver car with expensive TPMS sensors and factory warranty coverage, you may want to weigh the cost-benefit more carefully. A professional disclaimer. This content is presented as historical and educational information. Always consult a qualified tire professional before modifying your tires, especially on vehicles you drive at highway speeds. Part 6. The lesson that outlasts the formula. Here is what I want you to take away from this video beyond any specific recipe. During the worst rubber shortage in modern history, everyday Americans did not sit and wait for a corporation to solve their problem. Factory workers, trucking foremen, military mechanics, these were not elite scientists. They were practical people who understood the materials around them and used basic chemistry to keep the wheels of a nation turning. That spirit of practical self-reliance is what Oracle Prime is really about. Not anger at corporations, not conspiracy theories about suppressed inventions, but the recognition that, throughout history, the most powerful survival skill has always been knowledge itself. The same resourcefulness that kept a nation moving during its darkest chapter is still available to you, not because someone is hiding it from you, but because this kind of practical, unglamorous knowledge simply fell out of the mainstream when survival was no longer urgent. When tires became cheap and abundant, when roadside assistance became a phone call away, the incentive to learn these skills vanished. But the knowledge did not vanish. It is right here. And once you understand the principle behind this formula, the concept of a preventive sealant that works from the inside out, you start to notice the same pattern everywhere. Simple, effective, historically proven solutions that cost almost nothing, pushed to the margins not by villains, but by the quiet gravity of markets that reward complexity and recurring revenue over simplicity and prevention. Ask yourself, how many other pieces of practical knowledge from your grandparents' generation are sitting in the same category? Not suppressed, just forgotten, waiting for someone curious enough to dig them up. That is what we do here on Oracle Prime. Thank you for watching. If this journey into wartime chemistry and forgotten survival engineering taught you something new, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Share this with anyone who has ever been stranded on the side of a dark highway. The best way to honor the ingenuity of the past is to carry it forward. Stay curious, Stay self-reliant, and we will see you in the next video.